Hey, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
So this week we had our monthly question and answer session for our profiler training students who are going through the digital coursework for profiler training leading up to the live event in a couple of months. And one of our students asked a really interesting question. He was talking about how, as an intuitive, he was doing okay in his profiling sessions, because again, learning the skill of profiling, the discipline of this, he was doing okay, but when it came time to explain someone's personality type, especially if they were a sensor, he was having a hard time bringing the things down from a conceptual level as an intuitive to a more concrete, explained level to someone that may not be thinking in the same abstract terms he is as an intuitive. So we were doing some workshopping around how he could basically talk about personality type and explain, like the Myers-Briggs system as an example, or someone's personality type in a more clear, concrete way. And so what we thought we could do on today's show is help you, because I bet in your life you have people that you want to help explain the system to. I thought we could take just the dichotomies today and break down how you can explain the difference between introversion, extroversion, sensing, intuition, thinking, feeling, judging, perceiving, to the people in your life. Give you a really easy mechanism to do this with. And that's a way to start conversation and discussion around something you're most likely very passionate about.
I like this frame of talking about the basic fundamentals of type and looking at it through the lens of how do you explain it to somebody else who you love and you're trying to help and maybe is trying to meet you in the middle, but might not have a lot of interest themselves because they don't initially see the value. So this might be well-covered territory in the content itself. Like we probably have talked about this in previous podcasts, and a lot of the information you can find, like in a basic Google search. But I like this idea of framing it for somebody who is really trying to care about something you care about. So looking at it through the lens of talking to a person who is trying to meet you halfway, but may not have their own interest in the subject. One of the ways that you can spark somebody's interest in all of this is to help them understand its practical application for them. Because we're all interested in something that, helps us understand ourselves a little bit more, helps us understand how we operate and why we do what we do. But I think oftentimes when somebody isn't intrinsically interested in the subject themselves is because they think it's too, oftentimes it's something like, well, it's not scientific, or somebody said it's not a real thing, or it's too broad categories, or I don't identify with that. So dichotomies are a nice place to start because they're a simple premise that if explained well, most people will resonate with the concept, as long as it's not too conceptual. So bringing it down to a practical level and helping them understand how it relates to them as an individual is obviously the best way to go to whet their appetite to be curious about more.
I would also say that look for opportunities of access points, meaning we think in terms of, my girlfriend or my friend is an ESFJ. I got to explain what an ESFJ is. Well, there might be opportunity to just explain the difference between introversion and extroversion in some aspect of their life. They might be having an issue around that in their life, and now you have an opportunity to just explain the one dichotomy and how it applies to them. Your difference here, well, of course she needs alone time because she's an introvert, and you explain that, and you explain the differences to that person so they get it. And you don't have to explain the entire type to them. So you could explain just one of the dichotomies and help them with whatever issue is happening for them opportunistically.
Yeah, one of the things I mentioned to our profiler training student is, and by the way, he was talking about explaining cognitive functions. And I absolutely sympathized with his challenge because that was one of the biggest problems or challenges that I had early on when I was doing profiling sessions. Is I would start talking about these concepts that I was endeavoring to master myself, and I hadn't gotten it to a place yet where I could break it down to its simplest, most practical components. So that's the tough spot. When you get to a place where you understand these things enough to be able to break it down, that's when you can sort of pat yourself on the back and go, okay, I think I've got this down. Cognitive functions are tough to do, though. even in a place where you're talking about functions all the time with other people who are talking about functions all the time, being able to break those down into their most practical application and help another person who may not give two craps about what all of this is about go away with something that can be useful in their life, that's a tough thing to do. It always is. So it's always a matter of looking at it through the lens of what can they go home with? What is the gift you're going to offer them that they can grab and go home with? And it has to be put into a place that's simple enough that's practical for them. Like you said, what's going on in their life. If you know something that's happening in their life and you know an understanding of just one of those dichotomies might be something that helps them see it in a different way, or helps them maybe give themselves permission to take an action that they wouldn't otherwise do, or diagnose a challenge that they're having with another person, or whatever the case may be, then I think that that's the best way to get the person, sort of to go, oh, there might be something to this. So let's start with those dichotomies, as you mentioned. And we don't have to go through all of the definitions for all of these. I mean, we've recorded podcasts on those before, but we probably will be touching a little bit on that. So the first dichotomy is introversion and extroversion. And on a conceptual level, the way that we always describe it, the way we've got it in our book and podcasts and that sort of thing, is which world is the real world, right? Is it the inner world or the outer world? And that's a little conceptual. Most people don't really... we say it that way because we're trying to get to the heart of it, to the foundational component. It's etymology where all of the other behaviors are built on top of it. But I think if you're talking to somebody who's unfamiliar with all of it, what's nice about introversion and extroversion is that it's now in the public unconscious, right? Like, people are talking about this. There seems to be burgeoning scientific information. This psychological world, for some reason, loves the big five, even though it's got its own problems. But introversion, extroversion is part of the big five. So it's sort of like scientist approved, if you will, if you want to call them scientists. But it's got some backing, right? Most people are they don't reject this notion, which makes introversion, extroversion a really good place to start, right? It's nice that that's the first set of dichotomy letters, because that's someplace that almost everybody can meet in the middle. And I think a lot of people like the easy to understand concept of shyness versus being outgoing, which is why I think we have a tendency to talk about that component of it. But I also feel that people are intrigued by things that are counterintuitive. And if you can give them the gift of understanding something a little bit more than how the collective unconscious understands it, I think a lot of people, at least you'll give them a sense of superiority, which everybody likes to go home with, right? Everybody likes to feel a little smug. So telling people that introversion and extroversion isn't about shyness or being outgoing is oftentimes a really good way to get people intrigued to all of it, because that goes counter to what is believed about this dichotomy.
We also believe... when I don't say you and I mean people in the outer, most people in the world believe that it has only to do with people. I like to be around people, or I don't like to be around people. I like to be alone. And that's not it either. So that's also something counterintuitive. You say, hey, it's not just about people or not people. It's more than that. It's about engaging with the external world.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people like to diagnose themselves as ambiverts. That's very popular. Those of us who are familiar with cognitive functions understand exactly what it means to be an ambivert. It simply means that you have an introverted and an extroverted cognitive function in the front seat of your car, and both of them should have a lot of influence over you. And depending upon which cognitive function you're visiting at any given time, you're going to be evidencing more introverted or extroverted behaviors. If you need a break and you're in your inferior function and you're an introvert, you're going to go to an extroverted place, and vice versa. So all of us are quote unquote ambiverts in the sense that we're all kind of coming in and out of all these functions. But for somebody who isn't familiar with any of this, acknowledging that they also are an ambivert and that everybody's an ambivert is usually something that strikes them as true. right? Like on some level, all of us are both introverts and extroverts because we all need to, and what I usually say is we all need to have some time to ourselves. Everybody needs a moment of going inside of themselves and visiting who they are inside that nobody else can see. But we also need a way to interface with the outside world. And there's a lot of interfacing activities that people enjoy. So just because you like interfacing with the outside world and can take a lot of enjoyment out of that doesn't mean you're not an introvert. And just because you like to go inside of yourself and explore what's happening for you and just taking a moment for yourself doesn't mean you're not an extrovert. We all have to have both of these things. That explanation, by the way, is staying in the realm of conceptual, but it's breaking down these concepts to a place where most people can sort of resonate. And then as you touch on that conceptual level, you want to bring it down to the practical as fast as possible. Of course, we're talking about having conversations with somebody who's trying to meet you halfway because you love them and they love you. So the assumption is that you are familiar with this person and their behaviors. So one of the best ways to break down this introversion extroversion piece is to call upon the known behaviors that they have and to try to explain how it relates to this idea. So if you're talking to somebody who's introverted, go, like you need to interface with other, the outside world. But for the most part, you take the most pleasure when you are exploring who you are, right? When you are figuring out what this all means for you. And you just need to shut out the outside world for probably, a couple hours a day, if you could get it, in order to have that time to yourself, in order to be able to get your energy back through a personal relationship with yourself. And I've noticed that if the person I'm talking to is an introvert and you tell them that, sort of this idea of a relationship with oneself and shutting out the noise of the outside world in order to really form that bond of introspection with oneself, and that's healthy, that gives introverts a lot of permission, right? And that's what they're looking for. The reason why, by the way, there's introversion, extroversion, the collective unconscious is because there's a whole host of introverts out there that feel like the extroverted world is pounding on their door all the time, which in some ways it is. It's doing it to us extroverts too, by the way. It's horribly obnoxious, and all of us need more alone time than we get. But it's pounding on their door, and most introverts need permission to be introverts. And so if you can give an introvert permission to be an introvert and tell them that's a healthy thing to want and to need, and it's a normal thing to want and need, I think that is a good opening. That's a really good place to open up. If you're talking to an extrovert who may not find as much catharsis in an explanation of what this is because they don't need as much personal permission, actually, that's a misnomer. The misnomer is that it's introverts that need permission to be introverts, and extroverts are just embraced with open arms in the outside world. And I don't think that's accurate. I think there's a sense that extroverts have that while the outside world is their playground, there's also a sense that that we can be a little encroaching as extroverts, that we're I think it's not uncommon. Well, maybe it is uncommon. Maybe it's just me because I'm an ENTP. But there can be a sense that extroverts get, or a message that we're obnoxious, that we're too much, right? That we're doing, like we're just too much energy for everybody else. And so the extroverts that get that message and feel like it's their responsibility or obligation to do something with it, we will try to calibrate to be a little more gentle. Like we're not as bombastic or in other people's faces. And so oftentimes it gets channeled into something like ambition for work, or other ways of entertaining other people or engagement. But I think when I'm talking to an extrovert that doesn't know much about the system, one of the things I try to impress upon them is what you said, Joel, which is that it's not always about people. So extroversion is simply getting engagement with the world around you, or being engaged with the world around you. And you can do that without having other human beings there. So there are some extroverts that don't know they're extroverts because their extroversion, or the function they're using as the driver dominant function, isn't maybe all that people-centric. It might be more like if you're leading with extroverted thinking or effectiveness as an ETJ, and you're all about resource management, you may be so honed in on projects and so honed in on getting results and getting your goals accomplished through ambition or whatever, that people are just like one thing. Like, you don't really need to hang out with people. And at the end of a long day of project management, you might hope everybody, wish everybody into the cornfield. You don't want to see them ever again. And so one of the things that's oftentimes cathartic for extroverts is number one, saying that like your energy as an extrovert it's also normal. Like, there's a part of us that really needs to engage with that, an interface with that outside world or the world around us. And it doesn't mean that you're obnoxious. And I think those of us that are familiar with introversion and extroversion in the modern world, because we're getting so much messaging around this introvert revolution, we're getting so much messaging that almost in some ways that's the superior way to be, because scripts are constantly flipped, right? They're flipped on their head. If extroverts were the superior way to be and introverts all felt insecure about that, then when there's an introvert, revolution, the script is going to be flipped, and extroverts are these obnoxious people who are pounding down our door, and it's actually introverts that are the superior way to be. And I have run into extroverts who feel this way. People who don't really understand any of this information, but think that like they get this message that they're the bad ones. So if there's any of that going on with the extrovert that you're talking to, again, a gift of catharsis is good. There's nothing wrong with being an extrovert. There's nothing wrong with it at all. And there's a sense that that we need to be quieter, right? And that's not necessarily the case either. And at the same time, you can go do extroverted things without having other human beings around. So giving them the tool of saying, if I'm losing energy, but I don't particularly feel like being around other people, I can go engage in activities in the outside world that have nothing to do with other humans, and that's still me being an extrovert. And so making suggestions that are tailored to what you know about the individual, to tell them, go do this and this and this, like go on a hike, go, do project management, go blah, 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 blah. And that could also be you being an extrovert. And I think give those practical pieces, I think is the element that makes it so that the person feels really understood, and it opens them up to the other three dichotomies.
I think that's really key, to talk to extroverts and allow them, people that may not see the people part of it, and they're like, well, I must be an introvert because of that. I think that's really powerful because it gives us much more fidelity in that. So as you're explaining it, I think you can think about that. As we move to the second dichotomy, the difference between sensing and intuition, I just, again, imagine maybe a scenario here where you're like on an airplane sitting next to somebody and you might suspect they're intuitive, and you get a conversation and you mention it to them and they're like, well, what's that? How does that work? What do you mean intuitive? And you want to explain it to them. Or maybe one of your family members is a sensor and you're trying to explain to them the difference between yourself, maybe you're an intuitive, and your family member is a sensor. How do you get this concept to them? I think one of the most practical ways to do this, especially for this dichotomy, because you're talking about sensing and intuition, and if you have to talk about intuition at all, it becomes very abstract, because that's the realm of intuition, which is abstraction and not concrete sensor-based things. So now we're talking about bringing a model in to help describe the differences here to somebody that may be very new. And I think one of the best things to do to explain this is using the tool called the ladder of abstraction, which basically runs people through a very basic model of showcasing, exemplifying to them basically what a really concrete sensor-based example looks like in something versus a more abstract idea of the same thing. So you're almost looking at something on a continuum using what's called the ladder of abstraction. So let me just run you through a basic exercise here. On the one side of the ladder, on the concrete sensor-based side, we have Bessie the milk cow. So we have a milk cow producing milk with the name Bessie. And that's a very concrete, specific example. And we can actually, if somebody was sensor-based, they could go up and touch the milk cow, see it moo, get milk out of it. Like, it's a very concrete thing to look at. But if we go one rung up from Bessie the milk cow, we see cows. So cows are a little bit more abstract. It's not a specific cow named Bessie. It is cows in general. And if we went one more level up from that, we're talking about livestock. So now we're including other types of livestock animals. It's a little bit more conceptual. Again, but it's still concrete. Most people get the concept of livestock, right? And the things you'd have on a farm. And if you went one rung up, now we're starting to get a little bit more abstract. We could classify Bessie as a farm asset. So now a farm asset is much more conceptual than Bessie the milk cow. And you can start to see the rungs of this ladder moving upward and more abstract as we go up. From farm asset, we could go up to money, which is something that's, again, it's an idea we all have, but it's fairly conceptual. Like it's a conceptual model of idea. And one more rung up from that, we could talk about value, which is extremely conceptual. So we go from Bessie the milk cow at the lowest end of the spectrum, very concrete. It's a cow with a name, all the way up to value, which is a very abstract concept. And value can include a lot of things. So it's categorically broad and conceptual. So this is a very easy way, for example, to try to describe the differences to somebody maybe on an airplane in 5 minutes quickly, the differences in how people see things. Intuitives are going to tend to lump things and view things in more abstract terms, more conceptual terms. That's just how they tend to see things. And it's a lot of work for them typically to move down that ladder of abstraction and get more concrete. Whereas sensors typically start with the concrete, and it's more difficult for them to move up the ladder of abstraction and deal in the world of conceptual. And of course, as you're talking to somebody on that airplane, you do want to express to them, just like with introversion, extroversion, that ambivert idea, everybody's got parts of these in ourselves. Like we have both of these. We have abstract parts of ourselves and we have concrete parts of ourselves, more sensor-based parts of ourselves. And it's important to recognize that, but we're going to lean toward one or the other, and one's going to be more difficult for us to get to, or it's going to be more work, I should say. We have to work harder to get there, depending on how we're wired. And where does the practical application come of this? Like, why would I be talking to somebody on an airplane? Like, what would be the point of explaining this? Well, first of all, just to understand the difference if we had a conversation going. But you could offer something to the degree of, look, if you're wired more on the abstract, realize that a lot of people need more concrete things. And this is probably more obvious to intuitives, right? Because we have to live in that world. People need more concrete things to move through their life. They need things that they can feel are verifiable and reliable to engage with. And they need you to explain things in those ways or present things in those ways. Now, if you're talking to a sensor and they're more on the sensor side of it, you can explain to them or express to them, there's people that really just think abstractly all the time. They're not trying to be obtuse. They're not trying to have their head in the sky. They're not trying to ignore the fundamentals of life. They just are wired differently than you might be. And so they're thinking in these abstract terms all the time. And it may not make sense to you, but their brain's working the way it should. So this is a great way to create understanding and to explain something, I think, in a simple way to somebody. You could even memorize what I just gave you, that little model. You wouldn't have to understand the fundamentals of it. You could still try to explain this to someone.
One of the things I think it's funny about the Bessie the milk cow example that we always use is that whenever we mention it on a podcast, we invariably get somebody writing in to talk about how Bessie shouldn't represent money and that Bessie's a real cow and shouldn't represent money or value or be a farm asset, which is to me, so it's funny because I always think you're an intuitive, aren't you? and you're having a hard time separating. This is metaphor and illustration with, actually it could also be intuitive tertiary. I sometimes wonder if the people who write in the most defensive for Bessie are intuitive tertiaries, where it's like you got enough to get the model and understand it, but have kind of a little bit missed what the big model is meant for. All right, not that I'm saying that you intuitive tertiaries cannot understand the idea of the purpose of a model. That is not what I'm trying to say at all. Mostly what I'm trying to say is if you're about to write in angry in behalf of Bessie, it's just a model and you can cool your tits. All right, so if you don't have time to explain a model, actually, that model that you're talking about, the ladder of abstraction, is such a fast, quick model that if you're talking to somebody who's willing to give you the time of day, then it's a good one for really impressing in on what the purpose of, or like what the biggest differences between sensing and intuition. But I think if you've got somebody whose eyes are glazing over at the idea of learning a model, which I love models, so I don't understand why anybody's eyes would glaze over at the idea of a model, but my God, it's happened a million times to me. So when I'm talking about sensing and intuition to somebody who's lacking patience, oftentimes I just put it down to the intuitive part of us is the imagination part, and the sensing part is the realistic part of us. And so when I'm mentioning these dichotomies and I say everybody's got an imagination. They've got an imaginative part of who they are. And everybody's got a realistic part of who they are, where they've just got to get it down to brass tacks and live in this world. And those who are intuitive will escape to their imagination as often as possible. And those that are sensory don't like to play there as often. Like, they're far more intrigued and interested in being realistic. And so when you're talking to an intuitive, I think just starting that ball rolling is highly cathartic for them. Like, it's just catharsis to be able to know that this is normal. This is a thing. This is how their mind is wired. They are a person who is intrinsically wired for imagination. And oftentimes they'll let you go into far more detail about that because they're just intrigued and interested. If you're talking to a sensor who may not have experienced the pain that intuitives have of being sort of smacked in the back of the head for being in your imagination all the time, a sensor may not have a pain point around this. So, I mean, I'm realizing as we're talking, I'm kind of coming through the methodology or the on-ramp of catharsis. The gift you're giving to the person as you're explaining all of these things is a sense of catharsis. With introverts and extroverts, we were to talk about the cathartic feeling they can go away with. With intuitives, just knowing that intuition is a thing oftentimes already is catharsis. For sensors, there's not a lot of catharsis to be found in understanding this part of who they are because it's not usually a pain point. But if you look at it through the lens of talking to intuitives and having a relationship that can't seem to find an interception point or like there's constant tension, sometimes being able to explain what intuitives are and how difficult they can be in a sensor's life can help the sensor diagnose challenges in their relationships that give them a sense of catharsis. But usually when I'm talking to a sensor and this is just like them going, okay, that's who I am, I don't go into this very much. I just kind of go, those people who are like in their imaginations all the time, and you're a person who's like sort of more realistic. This is the realistic part of you. But don't forget that there's an imaginative part as well that needs to be honored.
I think there is catharsis when you talk to a sensor and you tell them there's imaginative weirdos in the world and that's how they're supposed to be. I think they go, oh, okay, that's why my Uncle Bob is that way. Okay, I get it. I can give him a pass. I thought he was weird Uncle Bob. Maybe he's intuitive Uncle Bob. Okay, I get it. I understand. Like, I think there is some level of like relief for that.
The people who are sensors that have the most catharsis around this concept are sensor parents with intuitive children. They're almost always the ones that experience a feeling like, okay, I understand why this could be important. And if you describe it as a person who's in their head all the time and in this imagination. Now, people in their head and in an imaginative place all the time don't have to be intuitives necessarily. Like intuitive tertiaries can sometimes be in their head a lot, like particularly ISPs. They can really identify with this part. And as an ISP, even though they're sensors, sometimes they'll identify as intuitives and they will take catharsis from this idea that they're in their heads all the time. And that's okay. Even if you're like, I'm pretty sure you're a sensor. Talking about the intuitive part of who they are and that they're wired to access this can also have a sense of catharsis. But if you're talking to somebody who's a sensing primary, like an ISJ or an ESP, oftentimes the gift they take away is if they have a relationship with somebody that they're struggling to interface with because that person's an intuitive. But otherwise, you don't have to spend much time here. Like, it's not like they have to really grasp this concept deeply, just enough to kind of to get what's going on. But if you think about the percentage of population that is intuitive tertiary or is intuitive, primary or dominant or auxiliary, when you think about how many people could get relief from this idea, it's a pretty high percentage of the population. And so most of the people you talk to, not just people who have intuition as a dominant auxiliary tertiary, and in car model that would be driver, co-pilot, 10-year-old, but people who are either one of those people or have somebody like that in their life that they have challenge interfacing with. That's a lot of the percentage of the population. So I think if you do it well, if you do it simply and, just and give the gift of some form of catharsis around this understanding, I think the majority of people you talk to will be able to take a gift away from understanding this dichotomy.
When we get to the third dichotomy of thinking versus feeling, this is where we can just basically say to somebody, this is how you're going to make your decisions. And again, all people think and all people feel. But if you're a feeler, you're going to take personal criteria and other people's emotions and feelings and perspectives into your decision-making as your first entry point. And if you're a thinker, you're going to take those things into account, but you're going to mix it in with all the data, all the information, all the hard, quote-unquote, evidence. Again, when I say quote, I don't mean it's actually hard. It might be cerebral evidence or imaginative evidence, whatever it is, but you're going to put it into a data set as one node in all the data, not as the primary place you enter. And I think that's a pretty easy, basic way just to explain the difference quickly to someone, because I think a lot of people think that feelers are all just emotion and emotive, and thinkers are cold and robotic. And I think we can start to break down that immediately by just talking about right out of the gate, hey, thinkers feel, feelers think. Here's basically the entry point they're coming to decisions. This is the place they're starting, and they're going to factor in other things too. But this is the place they start that process.
One of the ways I like to introduce this dichotomy is here's where all your fights come from. This is where the majority of people's fights come from. I think that's true because our cognitive functions, our thinking and feeling functions, are our judging functions. They're the ones that tell us how things should be, and when the world is not reflecting that, then we resist it, and then we feel like we need to go correct it. So when I'm describing this dichotomy to people and trying to make it really simple, I started out by saying, here's where your fights surface from. And if I'm talking to a thinker, I try to focus on the idea that you might come across colder than you really are, because all of us have both. Again, all of us have both. And what's the most cathartic idea you can get from the thinking, feeling component? For thinkers, it's you come across harsher than you intend to. People don't understand how much you care because of how you appear on the surface. And you might actually be easy to jerk around. Like you might have a hardness to you because you know that if somebody gets to the feeling part of who you are, they can do some damage. And so you might show up tougher than you actually really feel inside. And you might be kind of a big softie. On some level, most thinkers resonate with that. And that's cathartic. It's cathartic to think that somebody's seen through that in you, that they don't just take you for cold, that they actually know that there's something softer inside or something that is more compassionate internally. And even thinkers that want everybody to believe that, that they're sociopaths, which I've run into my share of thinkers that insist that they're a sociopath, regardless of whether or not they are. There's a part that usually, unless they don't want to be vulnerable to you, and let's pretend this person loves you enough to come halfway so they're willing to have some vulnerability to you, unless they've got that shell up in your presence and are attempting to convince you that they're, that you can't hurt them, most thinkers will capitulate and say, yeah, you're right. And I wish that I had more emotional intelligence, right? And that's another thing is that when to a thinker, part of the catharsis is saying we might need a little bit more training in emotional intelligence than other people do. And that's okay. Like we're wired to be looking at other things.
I think for feelers, the catharsis comes from permission, where, especially as a man, being a feeler man, I'm told I have to make logical decisions all the time. And in my religious paradigm, feelings are bad and wrong. They'll lead you astray. Your heart is treacherous. Use logic and God's word, or use logic and reason to make your decisions or whatever. And I think it doesn't really even matter gender. I think all of us, especially in the West, are pushed toward this idea of logic being the highest ethic. And so for a feeler to go, wow, I have permission to check in with how I feel about this, or what resonates with me, or the way it gets people's needs met and the way it creates harmony. Okay, I feel good about that. That makes me feel like I'm not doing something wrong or bad. It's permission for the feeler hearing that message. So one of the things you could express to a feeler as you're explaining this is that the process that they're using, or the feeling process, is a rational process. It makes sense. It may not be how thinkers process things, but for a feeler, that's the best way you should be making your decisions. Use your feelings to understand the best course of action and give yourself permission for that. It is a rational thing to do. And as a feeler to hear that, you're like, wow, okay, I had this suspicion I was being rational, but the whole world's telling me I'm irrational all the time and I'm illogical all the time. So this gives me a sense of feeling okay about myself. So I think that's one of the things you can give to a feeler for that relief.
Just to create a distinction for all the thinkers out there that are going, it's not rational. The function itself may not be rational, but using the function is a rational choice. Like a feeler a feeler should be using feeling criteria because that is how they make their best choices. So it's rational to use that criteria, even if the function itself is not following like the laws of logic, or they can't even explain why they feel the way that they do. It's still rational to use it because when a feeler uses feeling criteria, they have the best results. So it is rational to do so. I just wanted to make sure that I didn't get a thinker writing in.
You're making a lot of disclaimers so you don't get people writing in now.
I do. You know what? I do make a lot of disclaimers so I don't get people writing in.
I want you to write in if you're listening. I want you to communicate with us. I want you to go over and make a comment and share your story and give feedback.
All right. No more disclaimers for the disgruntled person.
You're just trying to not have people be grumpy. That's what it is.
I do. I don't like it. Well, I don't like it when people are grumpy with me and then I have to do the work of explaining it. When I can just explain it quickly on the podcast. Don't write in about this thing. I'll just take 30 seconds to do so.
Fair enough.
That way I don't have to write out a paragraph or two explaining ourselves. So the final dichotomy is judging and perceive, or judger perceiver. This is easily the most difficult for people to wrap their heads around. So
easily the most difficult.
Yes. Yeah. Am I supposed to make a disclaimer about that one?
No. I just thought it was a funny turn of phrase. It is the most difficult.
It is.
Hands down.
It just is.
I agree with you.
And so you don't have to. You don't have to get the person to understand this in its complexity, just like you don't have to get the other ones so that the person has a bone deep, marrow of their bones understanding. We like to say to us, or to me, I guess I just speak for myself, the simplest way to describe it is not necessarily a way that lands with everyone, but I'm going to share it with you anyway, and your results may vary. I like to say that for judgers, they like external organization to have inner world freedom, and perceivers like to have internal organization for outer world freedom. But that's still a concept that's kind of complicated to grasp. So if I'm talking to a person who I think I know their type, and they are, again, meeting me halfway and feigning interest in this thing to be able to interface with me, oftentimes I'll just talk about them and the good and maybe some of the not so good things that come along with being a judger or a perceiver. And the reason why is because if at this point you've done that thing of giving them a gift of catharsis all the way through this process, you gave them a gift in introversion, extroversion, sensing, intuition, thinking, feeling. By the time you get to judge or perceiver, you don't have to value add. You at this point can talk about some of the negative things that come along with it and give them a little bit of coaching, like a little bit of like a gift, not just of catharsis, but a gift of advice, effectively. So kind of like the world favoring extroverts, the bigger catharsis comes with introverts. The world favoring sensors, so the bigger catharsis comes with intuition. And the world favoring thinkers, so the bigger catharsis comes with feelers. The world favors judgers. And so the bigger catharsis comes with perceivers. So if you're talking to a perceiver, just letting them know that they're wired to not be on the stick all the time, like not your world in the outside world is you're wired to want freedom there, to be spontaneous and have expression and engage with it, not in a way where you're like, watching the clock all the time and ticking off all of the to-do boxes. Like you're wired to want some improvisation. And really good things come from that. That's where performance comes from. And, being a responder, like, and maybe even an early responder to something because you're really good at turning on a dime, or being a performer or something to that effect. A lot of people who are good at being spontaneous and responsive, these people they have a place in the world. And unfortunately, it also comes along with not necessarily paying attention to the clock and ticking off all the to-do boxes. So the catharsis for perceivers is easy because we get the message a lot that we just need to get our shit together. And that's not necessarily true. I mean, it usually is true. Don't get me wrong. It's usually true. But we're wired to not have our shit together all the time. And that's a good thing. That's okay because some really good stuff comes along with it. So the advice you can oftentimes give to perceivers is give themselves permission to be perceivers and just keep their finger on the pulse of anything that's truly important. Like one of the things I've done is I've given myself a rule that if nobody's relying on me for something to happen, I have some wiggle room with time. But if somebody's relying on me for that thing to happen, I have no wiggle room with time. So if I'm going to a party, yeah, I'm sure people think it's rude to be late to a party. But if I don't give myself wiggle room to be late to a party, then I will not be on time for classes I'm teaching. And so I've just simply put my real estate toward the thing that's far higher leverage because I only have so many units of being on time. And so I'm going to apply them to the thing that I'm responsible for, that people are relying upon me for. And anything that's a nice to have, I'm not going to apply my getting there on time units to that. That might seem very, very inconsiderate to the judges of the world, but I can only do so much. And so for perceivers, oftentimes just having a little hack like that, some permission and some understanding that if you only have so much, then you're going to have to apply it to the important things will oftentimes give them something to go away with.
I think one of the things that if you're explaining this to a judger that can give them catharsis, so you kind of explain the differences here, is this notion that everything is so organized in the outer world. Sometimes judgers think that has to be the same internally as well. And I think giving themselves permission to go ahead and have that freedom of wandering the mind or the heart inside of themselves is something they might be a little reticent to do, right? They're so organized and structured sometimes that there's maybe guilt or feelings of lack of permission, quite frankly, to go and just wander the garden of their mind or the garden of their heart and just be there and just play in that space. Meditation, slowing down, getting in touch with what's inside and resonating there. I think this is something that, judgers can feel like that has to be organized or structured sometimes, especially EJs feel this way. I think that's probably a message for EJs the most. But I think other judgers, even IJs can also struggle with this as well. The conceptual sweet spot then is getting just enough organization you can relax and you can wander your mind or your heart. I think that's the core of this to give that relief to a judger you might be talking to as you're explaining the differences here.
So just to recap some of the leverage points here, remember that when you're talking to somebody who is meeting you halfway here, you want to give them a gift to go away with. And the easiest gift to give them is catharsis. The catharsis of being understood and maybe having a little bit of something like a strategy to go away with. For introversion and extroversion, the easiest catharsis is to give to an introvert. But there's also a gift to be had for extroverts when you're explaining this difference, because they don't necessarily have to feel like they have permission to have louder energy, but that doesn't mean that they have to have full social acumen. They can also have extraversion when there's nobody around by engaging with the world. So there's just a little bit of permission there to be an extrovert without necessarily having to have people around. And there's also permission to have a louder energy for extroverts. For introverts, it's the permission to be introverted and to steal time away for themselves when it feels like the world is banging on their door. For sensing and intuition, the easiest way to understand it is with an imagination versus a reality idea. And Joel's model of the ladder of abstraction, if the person has the patience for it, is one of the best ways to really get the differences between these two things. But if they're not a person who really understands models very easily, the idea that this is the confusion we have with each other oftentimes. It's not where our fights are going to be, but it might be the source of some of our biggest misunderstandings. So to go away with, if you're talking to an intuitive, the catharsis of knowing they're intuitive and in their imagination and they're wired that way is a gift. If they're a sensor, the catharsis of being able to understand maybe somebody in their life that is more of one of these imaginative types. Maybe it's a kid, or maybe it's, one of their children or parent or relationship that they have, that can be a gift. but also understanding that they have an imaginative part of who they are and that they're wired for that is sometimes a gift to the sensor as well. For thinking and feeling, or thinkers and feelers rather, in this, the best way to frame it is to say, here's the source of your fights. This is where you have a tendency to fight. The catharsis for a thinker is knowing that there's a part of them that's softer than maybe they're showing up, and that some people might misunderstand who they are and their intent because they're coming across more harshly than they intend to. And for feelers, it's the permission to be a feeler, to not always have to have some sort of rational, logical argument for everything, every decision you're making, that it's okay to follow your heart because that's actually for you the most rational decision to make. And for judging and perceiving, as we just mentioned, this is part of the catharsis comes for perceivers, knowing that there's a thing called being a perceiver and that can be challenging in the world. And one of the things you can have them go away with is the idea of leverage points for where they're going to place their time and focus on making sure that they're not being inconsiderate to an organized world around them. And for judgers, the sweep or the catharsis can come from knowing that they don't have to be in control of everything at all times, that there's a sweet spot in there of being organized enough to be able to relax.
Now, remember, we mentioned this earlier in the podcast, if you go to explain something to somebody on a very basic level, you don't have to explain their entire personality to them. You can do it modularly or by topic or by one of these dichotomies. So you got to look at it almost as the 4 topics, introversion versus extroversion. It's energy. Where do you get your energy? What world is the real world? For the sensor versus intuitive, it's the understanding world. Are you having misunderstandings with people in your life? Well, let me explain something here to you that might help you. If they're having trouble with conflict, it's probably going to be the thinker-feeler dichotomy they're dealing with. And if it's organization, it's probably going to be the judger-perceiver. So if, again, I'm almost imagining a scene of you on a bus or an airplane talking to a stranger, striking up a conversation, and you're sharing some aspects of your life with each other, and you want to explain some of their personality to them, or at least personality in general. Maybe you could find one of these access points. It doesn't have to be all of their type. It could just be one slice of this around the topic that comes up in conversation. And it's a great thing for you to practice in your life to get better at talking about this with people you know, like, and trust. And it's a great way to start conversations with the people about something you're interested in. So your assignment this week is to go out and just take one dichotomy in a very simple way, explain it to somebody that doesn't know about this already. Maybe a family member, a friend, a spouse, somebody you know at work, somebody you know in school. Sit down with them or hang out with them just very quickly. Don't spend a lot of time in it, and just practice explaining the differences between one of these dichotomies and see how you do. And then go over to personalityhacker.com and report directly below this podcast how it went for you. What was coming up? What were the challenge points for you? What were the distinctions you were making? What was coming up that they were confused about or you were confused about in the process of explaining it? I think this could be a really great exercise to start training yourself to be thinking and how to bridge this gap and help people understand more about themselves.
Say modularly again.
Modularly. It's like a really hard word for me to say right now. I don't know why.
I'm surprised I can say it.
Modularly.
When I was a little kid, I had a speech impediment where I couldn't say R or L. Everything was a W.
Oh, yeah.
I used to talk like Elmer Fudd, and I would think that modularly would be an incredibly difficult word for me to say.
Modularly. Is modularly a word?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I know modular is.
Yeah. Well,
Lurie.
I don't know. I'm not sure if would it be accepted into a Scrabble game?
I have no idea.
I don't know. Let's pretend it is. And it was adorable. Also, I noticed that I kept saying, when you're explaining it to a loved one and you kept saying, like when you're on a bus or an airplane. I'm like, I think this podcast can work for both. All right, so either context.
Sometimes I sit next to loved ones on buses or airplanes.
That's true. And sometimes I talk to strangers. So there you go. Works both ways. If you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. We have personal growth programs that you might be super interested in. And if you are, go to personalityhacker.com and look under our course catalog to find a personal growth program tailored to your personality type that is right for you. We also have a book. It's called Personality Hacker. You can get it all major book retailers. It's a lovely read. And if you feel so inclined, you can give us a rating and review on Amazon or Goodreads. That helps us out a lot.
I can't wait to hear back from you on explaining stuff to people in your life. I want to hear. Personalityhacker.com. I want to hear from what your experience was. I'm Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we'll talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast.